This program is produced using the resources of Public Media Network in Kalamazoo, Michigan. Learn more at publicmedianet.org.
All right, let's get it going. All right, welcome to Connecting Communities, a podcast about the environment where we live, work, and play. We talk with individuals from our community and the greater Kalamazoo area who have a positive impact. Today, we're with three guests to talk about fire ecology. Mary Parr, fire ecologist, Michigan and Natural Features Inventory for MSU Extension and of the Sioux Tribe. Mitch, Lettow, Southwest Michigan Land Conservancy Conservation and Stewardship Director. And Jesse Lincoln, plant ecologist at Michigan Natural Features Inventory for MSU Extension. Welcome, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
This is part two, talking about burns. So we talked about a lot of general items and educational items on the last session. So where do you want to start us off this week for going in a different direction?
So many different directions we could go.
Well, in my opinion, I think it makes a lot of sense to start with natural communities. So natural communities are these assemblages of plants that occur across the landscape. So these repeated groups of plants that occur under similar conditions across the landscape. So we've classified like almost 80 natural community types in Michigan as Michigan Natural Features Inventory, where Mary and I work. And some of those are very common. Beech maple forest, that was one of the predominant community types in the lower peninsula. And then all the way up to Isle Royal, you've got these volcanic bedrock lake shores, which are extremely rare. And so we have these sort of rankings, state and global ranks. So is it globally rare? Is it globally secure? Is it rare in the state, or is it secure? So we kind of, these natural communities are these collections of plants and animals, and we do our best to understand their rarity and the biodiversity that they hold. And some of our natural communities are dependent on fire. Fire shaped them for millennia, and these fire-dependent communities often have disproportionate amounts of rare species. So organizations like Mitch's often focus on protecting those places. The very few that we have left down here, they're often extremely imperiled. And then they work, not to step on your toes here, but they work to get fire back in them. So for me, as an ecologist, I always start with natural communities in this type of discussion.
Yeah.
In Michigan, what's the history of fire here?
Yeah, I can jump into that one. So fire does occur naturally through human and through lightning strikes. For a long time, in the research and academic lens, the story of lightning strikes has been predominant, despite there being a lot of knowledge and stories about Native Americans using fire on the landscape. And so, as Jesse discussed, that these different communities have ties with fire and require fire, indigenous peoples have been using fire for a long time, which has shaped these communities as well. And so there's a long legacy of stewardship using fire.
I think one thing that was really kind of transformative for me thinking about it was what Mary mentioned, is that you hear a lot about the lightning strikes. People assume that that's how they happened, and there's a great record in sediments and lakes of the pollen that has been, if anybody has seasonal allergies, there's literally, billions of these things floating around in the air. You can't necessarily see them, but you can feel them. But when they fall on the surface of a lake, they kind of fall in this very even pattern, and they lay down a record of the history of like the trees and plants that were in the landscape. And ecologists know what trees are associated with what climate conditions. So you can have hot, to make it really basic, you can have hot or dry, and you can have you can have hot or cold, or you can have wet or dry. So each combination. So they can see through time as things got, colder and wetter. Maybe they saw more cedar pollen falling in those years. Things got cold and dry. You might see something like jack pine that likes it in the north, but it also likes it really dry. And there are periods where the climate doesn't match what happened with the trees. And I don't know if that's I don't know what the technical name of it is, but basically a lot of folks looking at indigenous cultures and fire are seeing that as a divergence from the climate, where the climate should have pushed the trees in one direction, but because of repeated burning, you're seeing things like pines and oaks and hickories and things that really like fire. And so you see this fingerprint of human shaping the landscape through fire. So like I always go back to that if we're ever getting any barriers talking to the public about like using fire, that like it has been on the landscape for a really long time.
I do want to jump into dendrochronology. So while we're talking about evidence of human ignition, so dendrochronology is a way of using tree rings to look back into the past. And so you can look at these tree rings and there's certain widths and patterns to use it to model climate. But also certain species of trees like red pine are really good at recording these fire events. And so through a lot of work across the Great Lakes and across the country, they've been using these tree rings from a lot of pine species. In Michigan, we use red pine predominantly. And the resin that is produced from the fire in healing those wounds preserves the stumps. And so often when we're doing ecological assessments, we're looking for those artifacts because they contain this record. And so these records tell us the frequency that fire happened. So the intervals, if a stump has 50 rings and there's 6 burns, then we know that there was a higher interval in that natural community. There's also evidence through like seasonality. Sometimes you can see that in the tree rings. And so that's also informative when we're thinking about restoring these systems and what kind of fire they need. That helps point direction towards what kind of season will they benefit from getting exposed to fire.
That is such a great point, and it's taken me years of my career to arrive at a point that Mary just brought up, and I think it's worth kind of saying it again. The stumps that we're finding in these places have the unique fire histories recorded in them because these trees scar when fires happen. And what she's alluding to, or saying directly, is that we're seeing historically fire frequencies on many of our landscapes 10 times higher frequency than we can account for by lightning alone. And so what that tells us is that there is a massive indigenous cultural influence on many aspects of our landscape. Now, she's talking about red pine. That is a crucial tool for developing these fire histories. Down here, we don't have red pine, but we know there was over 1 million acres of savanna in southern Michigan. There was prairie in Kalamazoo County in south. Huge, I think 80,000 acres, prairie rond. And this prairie can't be explained by climatic shifts alone. So 5,000 years ago, there were these big climate shifts and a drying out period, and we had this huge expansion of the tallgrass prairie in the center of the United States, and it reached all the way into southwest Michigan. Well, that climate shifted back to cooler, wetter patterns, and the prairie stayed. And that can't be explained by climate alone. It's at a certain point, the prairie was driven here by climate, maybe exclusively, but it was kept here through indigenous intervention with fire. And it's a really interesting point. So in south of the Great Lakes, it was never glaciated, right? And you had millions of acres of fire-dependent systems for millions of years, way before people got here. So I'm talking in southeast, you've got the longleaf pine systems, and those have incredible fire frequencies of annual burns dating back thousands of years. That's driven by largely for millions of years by lightning strike and climate explanations. Michigan was glaciated. Those left, depending where you're at in the state, everyone says roughly 10,000 years, but it's much more complex than that. But as soon as the glaciers left, this area that is now Michigan was occupied by people, and they brought fire. And so all of our systems here have, as long as they've been in Michigan, have a long indigenous cultural influence of fire.
One other point of evidence that I think is overlooked that I do want to highlight is we have stories about people using cultural fire, and we have like knowledge keepers and elders that talk about it, and it's documented. Yet we often rely on these Western science sources of evidence like the dendrochronology and cores. Yet there's this group of people that's, it's always been here. And so I think giving more weight to those voices is important when we think about restoration and natural systems.
I think too, a really even bigger concept that I don't think most people get, I think there's a lot of conversation in our groups about it, but that fire does a really good job at shining light on, burning light on, trying to work a metaphor in there, but is that people pre-colonization were not passive inhabitants of the landscape. With colonization, we got a lot of these concepts of like wilderness areas where the native people were passive inhabitants, like, any other species that was out there. But it sort of set up a ideological framework to justify taking that away because it wasn't being used to its highest and best purpose or whatever. But fire does a really good job of illustrating that the inverse is actually true, is that people were not just taking care of the landscape, but shaping it. And the things that Jesse was mentioning and the pollen record I was mentioning really show that the climate, this driving force that impacts everything, they were actually able to, tend the landscape in a way where they could maintain something despite that. And so you see things like prairies, there's mass-producing trees, berry-producing shrubs, there's evidence of gardens and cultivation of crops and wild rice and all sorts of things as this bigger idea that people are active, words still are active shapers essentially of the landscape. And I feel like fire does, it really, to me, it does the best job at like telling that story.
Sophisticated. That is, it is one of the best words you can use for the land stewarding practices. Deeply sophisticated, generations of deep knowledge critical to survival. And back a long time, there are tribes in the UP that have been mining copper for thousands of years, over 5,000 years. And so metal mining is so incredibly complex and sophisticated. That was the first metal refining project in the world, was in the UP in copper country. And just to bolster Mitch's point, like these are very long-standing, complex and sophisticated relationships with the land, and fire is a massive and really important part of it, and super important for protecting the biodiversity that we have now and stabilizing the landscapes in this extinction climate crisis. So it's ultra relevant now.
So going off the history of this, if you look at the past couple hundred years, when I would imagine in some places fire has been looked upon as not a way to tend to natural spaces, and also looking forward as we go into much more turbulent times. Like, could you talk to that a little bit?
I think like we can all agree like the fire use on the landscape changed a lot as colonization occurred, and there were new people coming into the landscape. You had the fur trade, you had a lot of wars that were happening. There was a lot happening even into the 1600s that were disrupting those cultural practices. Like there was a lot of illness that came through, and then boarding schools started with assimilation. So throughout those things, we do see fire events happening in these dendro fire scar records. But until you get to about 1850 is when there's kind of a more clear halt. And that can be attributed to a lot of different things. There's a lot of shout out to the tribal preservation officers at different tribes that are very fluent in the history. for their particular region. But some of the landscape level changes are the influence of timber harvest. And so when large swaths of land are getting converted to prairie, when timber is being harvested, when a lot more people are settling, is when fire becomes more of a threat to those ways of life, especially when they're not familiar with fire and how it can be beneficial. And so that's kind of when fire started to get more negative propaganda. You know, Smokey the Bear comes out and more legal, or making fire use illegal on the landscape. Do you guys have more to add?
There's a great book called The Big Burn that is centered around this massive fire event in 1910. And a lot of the things that Mary said led up to that, but most people, and this still happens today, we hear about fire all the time in the news, most people's reaction to that is, well, fire's bad, we should try to prevent it. Like, it's like any disaster, you know, if you could do something to prevent it, why wouldn't you? But what people don't see and what's not really talked about is that fire is part of this, basically it's inherent to the place that we live. It's going to be here whether we try to suppress it or not. And so what Mary mentioned is like this cycle of regular fire was disrupted long before, you know, this place was called Michigan, and, you know, hundreds of years before that even. And then there was a more overt policy, I think, was it like the 3 o'clock policy or something like that? It was like when they found a fire, had to be out by 3 o'clock the next day. It's probably not the right time, but basically 24 hours. Okay. So the idea was that, you know, these national forests were there for profit and for timber, and they were like farming trees. So fire was a threat to that, you know, economic outcome that they wanted from those natural systems. And so it was a very overt, you know, legislative move to squash fire. And so what ended up happening is that the role that regular fire played, consuming a lot of the dead plant material, rejuvenating the plant life, you know, maintaining these habitats for different species of animals, things like that, was not happening. And not only was it not happening, but over hundreds of years. So basically you're building this tinderbox. And then when fire does happen, like in 1910, or like some that we're seeing right now, there's so much fuel that they're no longer as much of like the agents of healing and restoration that they once were, but they're just like sterilizing this place because it's so hot. And so that is something that doesn't get talked about as much in sort of the mainstream, but a lot of what we're trying to do now in our work is to bring that important concept back in and get these regular return intervals. And a lot of that is Western US and Northern Michigan, I would say there's some systems like that. What we've actually experienced in this area, and I won't necessarily go into it now unless we want to, but is that with the lack of fire, we mentioned like the climate would have made things colder and wetter, but people use fire to maintain these habitats. We get a lot of rainfall in Michigan, I don't know, like 60 plus inches a year or something like that. So sort of left to their own devices without fire, things will get brushy and small trees will fill in and squirrels do their thing, right? It's just like part of the process, and they turn back into these shady canopy, you know, lots of canopy cover forested systems, and you lose them. So actually like lack of fire can have different effects. Like it can create a tinderbox in some landscapes, but in at least in Southwest Michigan, here a lot of what it's done is actually kind of like smother the history of what was once there, because it's not really recognizable as a prairie or as a savanna because it is filled in and we just see like the woods, right?
I think Mitch brings up so many good points there, and you know, there are so many points we could follow, but you asked about like fire moving forward. I think you asked about that, and because of the rainfall, because of the Great Lakes, we're really buffered from some of the more extreme aspects of climate change, some of the more extreme drought. When you look at what's happening out west, especially where you get this model of, you know, these low severity, high frequency fires kind of kept this landscape open. In the absence of that, we've got these areas just filling in with trees, becoming these dense forests, the inevitable spark hits. Now you've got 500,000-year-old trees dying in these landscapes that were stable for a long time. And fire is no longer the stabilizing force, it's a destabilizing force that completely shifts the structure of these natural communities that you see mountain after mountain completely annihilated by these infernos. And now, with climate change, those trees that had just been there for thousands of years are no longer actually able to reproduce. Even if there was a seed source, those aren't suitable habitats for them anymore. Their range has actually shifted. And so now you've got a complete divergence from what was historically there for thousands of years. That's not quite true yet in Michigan. And we're not, as a culture here, conditioned to understand what's coming the way they are out west, but it is coming for us. And so in the same way you see these oak forests, you go through these oak forests over and over again, in southern Michigan especially. White oak is the dominant canopy tree, 150 years old. You look in the subcanopy, all you see is red maple, not a single white oak for miles and miles. And it's for a couple of reasons. It's because of a lack of fire. White oak loves fire, but it's also because of deer. And now you've got this understory filled with red maple. You get a wildfire there, or somebody throws a cigarette out, and it burns it down in a drought year, right? We're gonna have droughts that are gonna burn these forests, and you've completely lost your seed source for white oak, and you have nothing coming back. You have now set that system on a totally different trajectory. That is what's coming for us. That is what's coming for us. When you go up north, it's an analogous situation where you've got these vast areas of red pine. They can't get red pine to naturally regenerate over much of its range. It's not regenerating at all. And I mean, this is a point that I've been obsessively barking at these guys.
Mr. Red Pine.
So you're gonna have to forgive me a little bit. But in the absence of this natural reproduction or reproduction influenced by indigenous cultural fire, they're converting thousands of acres of our state forest to plantation with herbicide every year because it's one of our most valuable timber crops and they can't get it to reproduce. And in the absence of the application of fire in a much greater footprint, I mean, at least 10 times what our state is putting down now is what we need to be putting on the ground. In the absence of that, we're gonna continue to face management challenges that boggle the mind, including huge applications of herbicide, and we're gonna face ever increasing risk of wildfire and then new successional trajectories for the systems on our landscape now.
What's the struggle with the mindset of fire management with the state? I mean, you don't have to speak entirely, I'm sure this is a massive amount of, ground to cover, but if you had a few points that you would like to see addressed on a state level, because I mean, it's not just the state, right? It's your counties, your townships, your cities, and all these places have probably different management plans or lack of, and then everyone talking to each other and making it work.
Dedicated.
State of Michigan or state government?
I would say, well, I mean, we're in the state of Michigan. I think it's fair to talk about us here.
Dedicated prescribed fire teams in our state government system. So in the same way we've got a wildlife division, we've got a forest resources division, we need a dedicated team of prescribed fire specialists that operate across our state land.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned seasonality a little bit in the stumps. I would say what I've seen in my community of fire and restoration, folks that are practicing it, is that most of the fire happens in spring, not right after, but after the snow has melted, things have warmed up a little bit, the dry grass and leaves, or the grass and leaves have dried out a bit. It's not super hot yet, the days aren't super long, so the climate sort of puts these bookends on your fire and makes it a little more convenient and easy to use, but there's lots of records showing that one of the predominant seasons that a lot of the native folks around here were using was September and fall. And there's some interesting research, Mary, going on with seasonal use of fire in different systems at different times of year. And so with the concept that Jesse's presenting, you could have people, putting fire down in spring, summer, fall. We've burned in December before. If you get a winter that's not like the one we're currently experiencing, we've had some that have been pretty mild and not a ton of, you get the La Nina, El Nino cycles, that sort of thing. So, historically people were probably responding to these in real time, but we're seeing enough of good diversity of results, like showing us different things that happen when you use fire in different seasons, that you could have people dedicated to using fire like year round. And then obviously there's a ton of planning and communication that goes with it. So like it's easily full-time job.
And to add to that, like one of the current issues of why we're only applying fire, or why certain agencies are only applying fire in the spring, is because they also service fires out west. And so when there's a big fire, they often call resources, and often a lot of the big fires are happening in August through September, which limits the ability of these practitioners at home to be able to burn. One other thing I would add to Jesse's very good point about having a dedicated fire management group within the agencies is prioritizing collaboration with existing practitioners. So there's a lot of people throughout the state that are interested and excited about fire and are, fire practitioners as ecologists, for nonprofits, for tribal entities especially. A lot of tribes have like resources that they collect on state and federal lands. And there is some intention with co-management of those spaces, incorporating fire into their management, but it needs to go further. And it needs to be a dedicated effort to blend different crews, to learn from each other, and to make sure fire is accessible and it's not gate kept and restricted behind agencies.
That was such a great point.
And as you can imagine, like there's a legal and logistical like minefield as far as like insurance and all these other things that are not very exciting to talk about.
Liability.
Unions. So there's a ton of barriers in our modern world to using them. But I think that's the challenge, is like working across boundaries, both literal boundary, like property boundaries, but also like between jurisdictions and tribes, nonprofits, and all these sorts of things. And so I think like the Michigan Prescribed Fire Council got touched on a lot in the last episode. It's a good example of like that interface where a lot of those conversations can happen. And Jesse will be speaking there, and maybe.
Yeah, well, yeah, hopefully speaking. I think, let's imagine a hypothetical state that created a fire program. The programs in a lot of states have been built to suppress fire, to suppress wildfire. As prescribed fire has emerged as a critical need, it has simply been incorporated in the fire suppression program. So these hypothetical agencies have developed, not Michigan necessarily, have developed these programs that are centered around fire suppression and staffed with people who are really good at that. And maybe prescribed fire isn't a central aspect of what they're trying to put down. And so some of the nuances of prescribed fire could be better handled in an organization that is built by prescribed fire specialists who are educated in prescribed fire. I'm trying to tiptoe around this because it is, we work very closely with these people who are very good at their jobs and take it very seriously, but you see sort of these differences in spirit around prescribed fire and fire suppression. And as close as you think they might be, they're often worlds apart.
They sound like opposite.
It's a paradigm shift, I think, for sure. And we're talking about that like historically with the fire suppression policies, and it's still there today. And we work with local fire departments, and those fire departments are saving people's lives, saving people's houses, and like so the whole framework around what they do and part of their identity is like putting out fire, and that is their job. So sometimes we work with fire departments, and we're both familiar with fire, but in a very different way. And so you see the barriers of language and techniques and equipment and sort of like the pace of even what needs to happen and the strategies that they might use to burn a prairie versus what we're going to do are very different because you're sort of brought up in a different cultural box, and we're having these conversations, but you're still kind of limited of like your original baseline. You have to sort of work through that, I think. So
I mean, I
that's
think
the challenge.
From just looking into what fire departments do, you're saving lives, but you're also saving capital, right? And so like you have humans that have been very centric to what humans do, and then thinking themselves outside of the natural landscape, where I think a lot of us realize that's not the case. And so I would think that's probably part of the hardships of change of mindset, part of it.
Another element is education, public education too, which is one of our focuses through the council, because often people want to burn the leaves in their yard. They want to be able to use fire and manage their property for biodiversity, but they have to know how to do it in a safe way. And so that's where providing education and training kind of gives them a fuller picture of everything that's involved. And now going forward, there's like in the state of Michigan, as citizens, we have the right to burn. And so the state has created a certified burn manager program to educate members of the public, people burning, about this process, get them certified and registered in a way, and then be able to better communicate with those people.
Could you expand a little on that? Because like just even within the city of Kalamazoo, right? We're a no burn city. We have leaf collections, and we have some conversations with citizens about just leaving the leaves where they are. All of these different management programs. How would someone approach that if they had those stipulations?
I'm going to turn to the Kalamazoo locals.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's, what are you using fire for? Like in that case, you're burning the leaves, you're getting rid of what, is a resource, like ecologically, as a way to get rid of it. Are you using it like to have a campfire or whatever? You can have raised, fires in the city of Kalamazoo. But yeah, I think it's very context dependent, I would say. So it's always like the pervasive thing in ecology is always like, it depends. So I would say it depends. Yes, sometimes like leaving the leaves could be the best thing ecologically, but like we were, Jesse was talking about the red maples and the oak systems and that sort of thing. The leaves in that system actually squash and suppress a lot of the understory plants, as opposed to like our beech maple forests that are very adapted to that, where the flowers and the wildflowers and things underneath actually need that pulse of nutrients. In the oak systems, it smothers, which is why burning happens. So obviously people have different motivations for wanting to use it for different reasons, and I would say, yeah, very context dependent. But I think the mindset of a city is like, we've, I don't know, 80,000 people in Kalamazoo or something like that. So, for everybody using fire responsibly, there's going to be somebody who, I don't know, maybe having a couple beers, maybe walk away from the fire for a little while and come back and their front porch is on fire. So I think there's very good reason for those policies on that local level. But so that's what we're trying to work through of like, we also have nature preserves in the city of Kalamazoo. So Asylum Lake, Kleinstuck, Bone in the Clouds, places like that. We have used fire in these places, but again, we're coming up a little bit about that language barrier, and like what's more important in a city typically is the safety and suppression aspects. And so there's a little bit of worlds kind of bumping up against each other in that.
When you have a burn at, like, say, Bone in the Clouds, like, how do you have to work with local municipalities as far as like the government bodies to talk about like when those things happen and who is there?
Yep. Yeah, all of that comes down to a burn plan, and that is I think a piece of common language that the municipal firefighters like gives them reassurance and gives us a plan to go by, and it's a good idea. But in your burn plan, you're going to have lots of maps. You're going to have listed the resources for emergencies, how many people you're going to have there, what kind of gear they're wearing, what kind of tools you're going to have on site, how many gallons of water, what happens if it gets out, do you have what's called secondary containment? So maybe where you're trying to burn is bound by like a creek and a trail and a road. So those are natural things that naturally don't burn. What happens if a little ember, the wind shifts or something, ember jumps the trail and gets on the other side? That would be like a secondary containment. If it gets out, what's your backup plan? And then you would go to that. So it's a demonstration on the landowner, in this case like a nonprofit, that they're doing their due diligence, they're doing their homework, they've thought this through, maybe like a not if but when kind of situation where we don't really say controlled burns anymore because fire is a very living, dynamic thing, but we try to plan as much as we can. And so that plan, I think, is a common language that municipalities like to see, but it can still be hard to even get that to rise to the level of attention of even if you have a plan.
And to add to that, like, especially when you're burning in urban areas or in places that have a lot of human interface, like you have hospitals, you have interstates, and so that's some of the things that goes into navigating the burn plan is, knowing your weather prescription, like what are the needs of this site, and then what are the constraints that we're working within. Like if you're next to an airport within 10 miles, like you do have to call them and let them know that you're going to be putting smoke in this direction during this time frame. Calling the dispatch and just telling them, we're going to be burning, we have approval, we have everything we need. If citizens call you, reassure them that it's under control. And so that's where it's very situational. Everywhere you work, it takes a lot of community knowledge to know who to talk to and who to help navigate some of those things.
Yeah, and I mean, this is super relevant for Kalamazoo. As a conservation scientist, I tend to be thinking about these things on pretty large scales and generally on public lands or working with land trusts like Southwest Michigan Land Conservancy, which is a great organization. And I'm not really thinking about like burning leaves in your yard. It's just not really an issue often. But in Kalamazoo, we've got Gordneck. We've got Gordneck State Game Area that is almost entirely within the city limits of Portage, and that's a big deal. And so you start everything Mary was just talking about, like hospitals or smoke management or like literally interstates. Everything she just said is a massive factor in getting burns done, and it's why it's incredibly difficult to get burns done in Gordneck. I think they've done one in the last 15 years since I've been paying attention to this topic, and they should be doing hundreds of acres a year probably. They have about 2,500 acres of land in Gordneck, and maybe 1,000 acres of it has a meaningful need for fire on a regular basis, and it's simply not happening because of all these complicating factors. And education is critical. Education is critical. Hopefully this helps, right? What you're doing here today, but there's a lot of fire that needs to happen in this local community. Gordneck, Allegan State Game Area, just an hour away. One of our most important pieces of public land in southern Michigan needs a ton of fire every year. And so the need for this type of conversation to be had in a lot of places is so extreme right now. It's so important. It's so important. There's so many rare species that are just barely holding on. In Gordneck, Gordneck has incredible rare species that have their population strongholds there and nowhere else in the state. And a lot of those require fire-dependent habitat. And so it's just a great time to be having this talk. It's a really important topic.
And to add to that, it is doable to burn these places and spaces, and that's where members of the public, it should be exciting to see a smokestack in the air instead of that feeling of fear. And I think, the members of the public, like these state and federal agencies, they work for us. Like they work for the members of the public in curating those spaces and maintaining those areas. And so if the citizens are demanding this stewardship, I think it would provide more momentum to getting fire in some of these trickier spaces. Because oftentimes when they're thinking about burning in these very difficult areas because of these different sources of infrastructure, it's scary because of the public reaction. So that's where they have public information officers that work with the media to help distribute the narrative of like, this is what we're doing and why. And so it takes a lot of people to change the philosophy of fire being bad to fire being good.
You need, not only do you need local buy-in, but you need local advocacy.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I think, Jesse talking about the rare plants and talking about the ecology, I mean, we could talk about the positive results of fire when we bring them back to these systems. It just feels right. Like you see the response, you see how the system changes, and it's just like, this is a good thing. And everything from box turtles to wildflowers to things like that to birds, but none of that can happen if the fire department gets called and shuts down a burn because they see a smoke column. So our kind of dedication to the ecology and to the species has to also address a lot of these barriers that we're talking about. There was one time where it's actually at a funeral, but I walked out of the post-funeral luncheon, and my friends at the Kalamazoo Nature Center I knew were burning a prairie that day, and I wasn't thinking about it at that time, but I walked out and I saw something kind of coming down from the air a little bit, and I held out my hand, and there was a charred piece of grass. It was probably big blue stem or one of these big prairie grasses from the north side of Kalamazoo all the way down to Portage, by the airport. And it actually was doing what it was supposed to. It was lifting, they call it the smoke column, essentially. Forgetting the name of it right now. But anyways, you look at different atmospheric conditions that are going to elevate the smoke so that it's not staying on ground level or people have to breathe it. But yeah, it would be a really great cultural shift, if, like Mary said, if someone saw that and just understood that oh, they're probably burning the prairie, that's great. That brings back Hensel's sparrows and bobolinks and these, songbirds that only use these habitats when they're burned. But anyway, point being that none of that good stuff can happen if it gets shut down or these barriers get put up. And unfortunately, people don't generally pay attention to who was using the fire, if it was one nonprofit, if it was one agency, if it was a homeowner. It's fire equals bad. And so we have a collective kind of obligation to each other to make sure that we're really doing our due diligence to communicate, to put, to knock on neighbors' doors and to try to address some of these issues.
I would also say, kind of along this theme, fire is expensive. Fire is expensive, and we're also in a unusual political climate. Maybe not unusual, but we're in a political climate where
I'd say it's unusual.
Well, where there's a lot of anti-government sentiment and a lot of candidates that are running in this coming election are going to be running on anti-DNR platforms. So these are state and local positions, and I think I work a lot with the DNR and federal organizations, and I think anytime we can get a municipality to chip in and say, Portage is partnering with the DNR already, with the Wildlife Division, and I think if they were to fund a burn and platform it and talk about it at meaningful government meetings and really try to develop a partnership, that would go a long way in trying to and allowing the DNR to get fire in Portage in Gore Neck, and it would benefit the city too, because we had that tornado go through there, right? That's a ton of down wood on the ground in Gore Neck. That is a fire hazard, and a controlled burn or a prescribed burn would go a long way in mitigating that risk, right? And so what better partnership than Portage, who has means, to fund a series of prescribed burns and build that community education around prescribed fire, it's desperately needed. It's desperately needed, and I think it'd go a long way in kind of maybe helping the local culture accept fire.
As we come to a close tonight, let's talk contact. How do we get a hold of everyone here if you want to get involved with this?
I'll start. I would say best place for us, for Southwest Michigan Land Conservancy, is our website, swmlc.org. So we have volunteer opportunities there. You can visit some of these preserves where we have been using fire. Portman is one that's great, Oak Savannah. Chipman is very close to here, Bow in the Clouds. So you can find things like that. We keep newsletters, stories, what's happening with us. And then on a more sort of regular refresh is our social media. So we have Instagram and Facebook and kind of exploring some others right now. But Amelia Hansen, our media specialist, does a really wonderful job with those, and that really sort of is the face of the organization. So that's the best place to kind of find out what's going on and get involved for us.
Michigan Natural Features Inventory has a website and where we post all of our reports, which is a huge source of information if you're interested in particular areas that have had research and other things done. And then we also have a staff listing page that would have Jesse and myself. I believe we have Facebook and Instagram, maybe under MNFI, so search those.
Also give a plug for MNFI. Their website is awesome. Lots of great reports that these two and others have been involved in. One of the really cool tools that Jesse mentioned at the very beginning was the natural communities, all the different diversity of like these systems we had in Michigan. You can look at maps that are a really good approximation of where these systems were in every county and every corner of the state. So like go find where you live and you have this little slider bar where you can look at what it looks like now and then what the landscape was in these little colored polygons. And it's just such a fun way to think about what was here historically and maybe why you see some of the plants and animals that you do. Anyway, just...
Well, it sounds like we have
one
some
last
great- Oh, go
plug.
ahead.
We do have a story map of a prescribed fire model that is occurring on state lands, and so that's a deeper read, but the story map is a good overview of how to prioritize fire on state lands.
And that's located where?
On the website.
Okay.
Yep.
Well, thank you all so much for being here today.
Yeah, pleasure. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Great.